welcome to our panel, Behind the Green Curtain. Okay, so I just discovered that nobody got the hidden reference here. Dan did, yes, sorry, Dan did, yeah, which is referring to the Wizard of Oz and behind, okay, some nods, okay, yes. Okay, great, yeah, so, that basically editors are not these scary, unknown, individuals, and that's what we're here today to talk about, is to see what excites them in literature and how they work and how to establish a relationship of trust with them. And hopefully you'll pick up some tips here that you can then apply to relationships with other editors that you'll be pitching to or working with in the future. So in terms of the timing, we'll go till about 2:50 with the actual moderated discussion part of this panel, and then we'll have a good chunky 20 minutes for Q&A where we will have roving mics. So if you have something that comes up while I'm talking, just make a note of it because we'll definitely get to it. And then we'll have an announcement from Will at English Pen to wrap us up. Yes. And yeah, so I'm Sawad Hussain. I translate Arabic literature into English. And with us today, we have Archna Sharma of Neem Press, Daniel Bird of Granta, and Kristen, Vida, Alfaro of Tilted Access Press. As you see, we're going to be doing a bit of passing back and forth with the mics, so if you just be patient with us as we do that. And I'm going to hand it off to them just to introduce themselves and a little bit about their houses. Yeah, okay. Wonderful. Archna, if you could start.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Archna Sharma, and I'm the founder and CEO of Neem Press. We're a London-based independent publisher, and we publish books that change and broaden perspectives. We look out and seek captivating and crucial voices wherever we find them, including, of course, in translation. My background, and we've translated from, Turkish, German, Romanian, Arabic, of course, German. I may be missing one. And my background actually is out of publishing, so I medicine and healthcare finance. I've just been invited onto the IPG board, which I'm really excited about. And I also sit on an NHS Innovation Accelerator advising high-growth healthcare companies.
Thank you. Dan.
Hello. Yes, mic's on. Hi, I'm Dan. I'm an editor at Granta. Granta is a mid-sized independent publishing company, so slightly bigger than these guys, but not as big as the Fabers of the world. And I'm an editor there. The Granta list has always had a lot of translation about it. We publish from a lot of languages. I haven't memorized them, unfortunately. But some authors on the list include Mariano Enriquez, Sayaka Murata, Han Kang, Herta Müller, Ho Sok Fong, Jenny Erpenbeck, and Alejandro Zambra, but they're just a few of them that sit on there. I'm the more junior member of the editorial team at Granta, so I've been acquiring as of earlier this year, and kind of my journey into publishing was via, I was working at Waterstones, which is the biggest book chain here in the UK, for a long time, running events there and also bookselling, and then moved into publishing via the sales team at Granta. So I did that for kind of a couple of years before making the jump over, which has definitely inflected how I approach the work, I would say. But yeah, that's me.
Wonderful. Yeah, I remember when we chatted earlier at the London Book Fair, I just found that trajectory very encouraging. Yeah. Kristen.
Hi everyone, my name is Kristen Vida Alfaro and I'm a publisher at Tilted Access Press. We have worked with, and including our founder Deborah Smith has come through BCLT, so it's really wonderful to be here. And so historically we've published mainly Asian and now African languages, but we're moving a little bit differently in terms of how we speak about our editorial framework, and that's trying to kind of speak through waters, so translating waters in a way to get away from the nation state and thinking about language slightly differently in publishing. And we always try to do collaborative work, working alongside publishers from the places that we publish from, most recently in Thailand with Soy Squad, and it's a really wonderful, similarly not that similarly, but underfunded as well in Thailand. But you learn, the whole point is that you learn a lot through these collaborations about what's happening in publishing and translation elsewhere. And I found them to be really generative. So yeah, and a little bit about me. I didn't come from publishing at all. I worked at the Barbican prior to this, and before that, I was pursuing a PhD in cinema studies, and I applied for a part-time sales assistant job, and then was offered a managerial job. So I took it, and then a year later, everything changed. But that's how I ended up in publishing.
Thank you. I've been reminded to let you know that this entire session is being recorded and photographs are also being taken, just so you're aware. Okay, so if we can get into my first question, which is, what are the last 2 titles that you've required to be translated, and how did you come about them? If we could hear from Archna, please.
Thank you, Sawad. So actually, I'm going to cheat a bit and talk about 3 really quickly because they were 3 different routes. So one of them is The Jinn's Apple, which is YA historical crime fiction that Sawad brought to us. And it's fantastic, and that's by Jamila Marani, and Sawad has the translator. So that was obviously from Sawad. The second one is a set of short stories by Sheikh Halawi, and that's Arabic to English translation. Also, that came directly through our website. That's translated by Nancy Roberts. And the third one, The Book of Perilous Dishes, which is Romanian to English translation, historical crime, historical fantasy fiction, came through Artellus, which was agented.
Yeah, that was not planned, by the way. This is not being like, just talk about Sawad's pitching. Okay, Dan.
Yeah, so as mentioned, I've only recently begun acquiring, so I'm just going to talk about the last 2 books that I've worked on instead. So one was Toby Lackmaker's The History of My Sexuality, translated by Kristen Gurman, which came, I mean, I actually feel like these answers are quite boring, to be honest, which came via the Dutch rights holder. So we were pitched that, I think it was actually during or in the run-up to the London Book Fair, so it's kind of a classic example of that being a melting pot of work for works in translation. And we were approached by an agent on behalf of the publisher Das Mag. So yeah. And then the other one I've worked on recently is a novel by Walter Kempowski, originally called Tadlosa and Wolf, but now called An Ordinary Youth, which, as many of you will guess, is not a direct equivalent title. And that's translated by Michael Lipkin. Kempowski we have a longer standing relationship with at Granta, which kind of predates my time there. We've published 2 works of fiction plus a work of non-fiction. So that was a kind of an ongoing relationship with the German publisher. Mm-hmm. What's more interesting about it, I suppose, is whereas previously we have kind of acquired World English Language rights in Walter Kempowski and then sold the US rights to the New York Review of Books in the US. In this instance, because it's a far more formally inventive work, it's very impressionistic, and we approached the NYRB first, and they kind of came on board. So we didn't sell them the rights. We worked kind of collaboratively with them in publishing that because we wanted to ensure there was a US partner. Right. But yeah, so they're the last 2.
Okay, and so do you generally have like this established relationship with the New York Review of Books that always the US rights will go to them?
No. No, there is quite a close relationship with the New York Review of Books and Granta. I think we did used to distribute their books in the UK, so we do work with them closely. But no, we work with a range of US publishers. It's just with Kempowski specifically, they have historically published him.
Right, okay. Thank you. And Kristen?
So the last 2 we brought in, and one is actually 2 translators are in the audience. So one of them is Delicious Hunger by Hai Fan, translated by Jeremy Tiang. And then the other one is The Woman Who Climbed Up on the Roof, which should be translated by Anton. Where's Anton? Next to Jeremy. Yes, so we're very excited for these books, and they came to us in different ways. Jeremy pitched it to us, and then with Park Soyeon, we established a relationship with Green Book Agency, and one of the agents in Korea kind of described some of the writers, and this particular writer stuck out to me. And then it turned out that Anton was, had translated the sample, so it was all kind of serendipitous in that way.
Wonderful. And if I can just continue with you, if moving on to a sort of follow-up question here is, how do we as translators go about establishing a relationship of trust with you specifically as an editor, and then if you want to add on anything else in general, with editors in general, but what would work for you specifically to establish a relationship of trust?
I think about this question because when I saw this, I always talk about trust, but I never talk about how it's established. And in a lot of ways, it can be organic, and very personable. We started as a house by a translator, and that kind of enabled. It made me see things differently when I came into publishing, and then it also helped me meet translators first in a lot of ways. So I don't know to answer exactly how. I'm not really. Do you have any specific ways to gain trust? Do we have trust exercises?
I think we should
What does
start.
that look like in publishing?
I love that.
Yeah, let me think a little more.
Yeah, falling back into translators' arms, I guess, is probably a good way. We do. I feel like one of the key ways that we build trust with translators at Granta is through reader reports. I think that's a kind of a key exercise in doing so, and that's where I meet people and then kind of turn to them to kind of ask their opinion on other work that they may go on to translate, they may not, and that kind of establishes quite a strong dialogue, I would say. I think it can quite easily, that relationship can quite easily become me just reaching out to people and then responding with a report and kind of not go any further. But actually, a lot of the kind of better relationships I have with translators have come from that process, and then they've kind of written to me independently and said, what about this? And that begins a kind of dialogue. I always make sure to make time during the book fair, because that tends to be a time where there's a lot of translators around, and I will definitely carve out time in my schedule to meet with a number of translators who I haven't met with before at that moment. Such as you.
Yeah, case in point, I just met Dan at the London Book Fair, and I think our connection, just to be open, is because I think you had emailed me to ask for a reader's report. I couldn't do it. I passed it on to a colleague of mine. But then when it got closer to the book fair, I was like, hey, it would be great to meet up. Do you have time? And he surprisingly said, yeah. So I was like, okay, cool. Yeah.
Well, it's also refreshing, the book fair is an intense environment, and it's nice to kind of have a perspective that isn't a rights holder. So yeah. I think they're probably the kind of, but I also appreciate, this kind of is maybe speaking to the kind of best practices question that we may come on to, but I also really appreciate short interactions, not just necessarily the act of pitching, but just a kind of a writing of oh, so-and-so just won this prize. Oh, this book is kind of doing things that you might want, you should have it on your radar. And that kind of short, kind of more conversational interaction, I think is really valuable and is often overlooked. Yeah. And also I appreciate it because it requires less time from me. Yeah.
I guess people knowing people and recommendations is always really good. So, translators can be a very close-knit community in the best possible way. And so when someone that you know and admire and respect recommends somebody else, then you're obviously going to be, assuming a level of trust. And we've done not even, close to the number of translations that both Dan and some of the actors have done, but we've been really lucky in our translators, and I suppose it's becoming friends with people and knowing how they work, and also just having translators that facilitate the communication with authors who may not speak English. That's really important. So I think Sawad is brilliant, so that's really important for us. But in general, I think that it's just getting a feel for people and working with them ultimately, actually.
So, for example, after this panel, we'll have some refreshments outside. Some translators would want to come, meet you, introduce themselves. Are you open to people emailing you a pitch, or would you rather, hold off and them approach you through the website, or, yeah. Are you open to pitches?
Yes. I would say we are open to pitches. The only thing that I would say is that we are very short-staffed, or at least we don't have the hours that editors can give at our house. So please be patient.
Okay.
Um,
That's all I ask, really.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Oh, did you want to say something?
Yes, same thing here, and just to note that it's very difficult now for us to do translations that don't carry funding. We're growing really fast, but cash is always king in any company, but particularly in a fast growth company. So we would really appreciate if you came with ideas for funding, and we're open, but also then we're acquiring for our 2025 and potentially 2026 lists now. So there just has to be that level of sort of foresight and patience. But yes, we're open.
Yeah, I think that's extremely true. It's always helpful if someone approaches you with like funding avenues as well. And although we can do that research, but it is nicer to have it come. I think something that you do actually really well is have, in terms of kind of approaching people after a talk like this, is do it using it as an opportunity to take a temperature gauge and just kind of say, here's a kind of rough idea of what this book is. Is it something you're interested in? Rather than kind of, because otherwise I feel like it's so often the case that you'll spend kind of hours pulling together a translation sample, which may or may not be funded, or kind of pulling together a pitch, and then I'll just kind of say, actually, that's not for me. And using these opportunities to kind of get a temperature gauge, which you did so well at the book fair meeting, for instance.
This is not planned. This is
Yeah, just
like,
singing your praises
cringing
with every
here.
question.
Yeah, this is kind of cringing here. Okay, Kristen, did you want to say something?
I won't say anything about you, but
Yeah,
she's
thank
wonderful.
you. Okay.
I just wanted to add, now it's slipping my mind. Oh, yes, know the press you're pitching to. I think that's really important. So why is it that your potential translation would be right for either of our presses? That's really important, and it does cut some time as well. So just do your research.
Yeah, so to save all of you a little bit of research here today, how about you let us know what excites you currently in literature, right? Because I think, as Kristen is saying, it's not just about the press, it's also the editor, right? As I'm sure you all know. So take it away. Let's hear what you're interested in finding or, want to see more of, possibly.
I always love political thrillers, historical crime fiction, but also voices that are dissenting in some way, shape, or form, be it about identity issues, be it about health or gender, and that come from, I suppose, troubled places, voices that find it difficult to be raised in their home countries, and voices and stories that could only have been written in those countries that they come from. So, and our thing is, take us to a world that we haven't seen before. And it can be a world right next to us, but just get us to open our eyes, lead us to the internet so that we can search. And if you can lace in even the darkest of themes with humor, I'm all for it. So those are the kinds of things that we look out for.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, sorry. Fabulous.
We keep turning this mic off for fear of being overheard.
Yeah.
I don't know why. We're not saying anything when we're sat here. It's always such a tricky question, isn't it? I mean, I gravitate towards kind of, disruption or kind of friction in my fiction. And I think that can be politically or it can be formally as well. I think of like works that have excited me recently outside of the Granta list, and it's work like The Employees by Olga Ravin, translated by Martin Aitken. It's Time Shelter as well, I thought was like phenomenal in that front. So yeah, I mean, I think naturally that means like my taste kind of gravitates towards the kind of more genre blending or kind of hybrid modes of writing, which is a kind of classic Granta space on both fiction and non-fiction. So yeah, but I mean, it's always that case of the voice is leading it for us. We publish authors, not novels or books. And that's, I mean, that's something as well that I really appreciate when I kind of get approaches, is someone who is pitching an author and not just a book, and kind of saying, this is where they sit, this is the work that they're doing generally, and this is the novel that you should maybe start with, but there's this wealth of other material. So yeah, that's helpful?
Very.
Okay, so in terms of what I personally gravitate towards, I've noticed that there's like there's a connection between almost rhythmic prose that where movement is so evident in the sentences, and I love that. And that kind of, I felt it when we bought this from Two Lines Press in the US, but Swahili Stories, I find the translations from Swahili into English were incredibly musical. And then end of August, Yumiri, translated by Morgan Giles, that is incredibly rhythmic and breathless, and I loved it so much, as I love all our books. But those are things that I've just sort of been drawn to. And to go back to kind of what kind of stories, I love labor issues, working class, the everyday feminist stories. One of the things that drew me to The Woman Who Climbed Up on the Roof, it's historical, but also historical fiction, and about a woman in 1930s Pyongyang. Anton can tell you more eloquently, but there's romance, there's humor, but it's also based in a historically researched archival research. And with Delicious Hunger, there's like, I'll never forget reading Jeremy's sample and just sort of, about communist guerrillas, but the everyday. And there's one particular story where, you have this kind of this really heavy situation of living in the jungle under those circumstances. But then you have this woman who is thinking about the boy she likes and being really embarrassed about having her period in the jungle. And I've never kind of come across that kind of instance within that kind of story. So things like that. And also, particularly language, I'm really interested, all of us at the press are interested in stories from languages that are really rarely translated into English, and all of the kind of context that comes with that fact.
Thank you. Okay, moving on. What do you each think is the greatest misconception about being an editor of translated literature or a publisher of translated literature? Some myth busting, maybe.
I'm not entirely sure how to answer this question, but I will have an attempt. Potentially that we're niche, that all we do is translations, and certainly for Neem Tree Press, that's not true. So we are actually fairly broad, probably a little too broad for the size, but that's historical reasons. That we have a lot of money because we take on translations, which is absolutely not the case. That we print, we publish inaccessible texts because there is this general thing about, well, why am I going to read a translated book when I've got, so many books in English? I think that's it.
I also had number one, it's niche.
Yeah.
So there's a theme there. Yeah. I suppose I was thinking about it more in terms of like the kind of possibilities with it. I mean, this is going to slightly stand against some of the kind of comments we've made about funding, but I just think in terms of the audience for translated literature being so broad. What was the term that's been generation translated fiction, whatever it is?
Yeah, from that report.
Yeah. But I mean, obviously there are kind of works that kind of spill over into, like Sayaka Murata is a prime example on the Granta list of a work that kind of like really caught fire. And Convenience Store Woman went on, I mean, it sold a lot in Japan, but it sold like 250,000 copies here, which is pretty
Wow.
remarkable for a work of translated fiction.
We're all like, whoa.
Or work of that nature, or work of any fiction, really. But I also think of, like Irene Sola is a Catalan author we published quite recently, novel called When I Sing Mountains Dance, translated by Marafé Letham. And like this novel, it was cruelly overlooked for the in Booker International, I would say. But it didn't, but it still went on to sell like kind of 13,000 copies across all editions, which is, I mean, yeah, it was pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
So there's definitely kind of an audience there ready and waiting, which is, I think, often overlooked. The other thing I have is that publishing translated fiction is a meritocracy, and all meritocracies. I mean, I was going to say this is maybe it feels like slightly negative, but I don't think it is necessarily. But I guess as I kind of was beginning to look into like commissioning translated fiction, I was just struck by where the funding is and the influence that has on the publishing landscape. And obviously you have organizations such as PEN who do amazing work in kind of broadening that out. Just going to call out someone else in the audience rather than you. But you can really see, I mean, like the funding from the Korean or Norwegian or many others, you can see the kind of influence that those kind of funding bodies have on the publishing landscape.
Definitely.
And so I think that's just something that surprised me kind of as I was kind of beginning my journey.
I've thought endlessly about how we can get money from Norwegian embassy.
And apply it to different languages.
With what we do is what I mean. But yes, we love Will and English PEN, so thank you. In terms of misconceptions, I don't have its niche, but I do, like, the first thing I have is the cost of translations and the time that indie publishers have. It's not much, and we work all the time, mostly. Or other people, even if they're not working on the press, they're working their other jobs. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And I actually, from my notes, just saw what I had written for how to develop trust. If I could just quickly go back to that.
Yeah, please do.
Clear communication is one thing. And, I'm trying to figure this out as we go along. And something that I've been learning is that having a clear discussion beforehand that is kind of beyond the contract, but in terms of expectations, what you expect from your publisher or what you want from your publisher and what they expect from you. I think I'm learning that I want to figure out a way to kind of establish this conversation prior, which, we haven't necessarily had to, because there's a lot of, you say, friendship, so personal relations involved, but it's really important. I'm learning to have that set out in the beginning.
Thank you. This leads us into our next question. Did you want to say something? No. Oh, okay. Is what do you wish translators would do more of? So you said you really appreciate clear communication, Kristen. And Archna, would you like to share?
What is always very useful, because we have to do it for all of our books, so our sales team, is to consider the market and to consider comparables and recent comparables and comparables in the UK market and then comparables in the US market, because that's how we can sell books. And we are, trying to up our sales. And I dream of the time when we have 250,000 or even
Me too.
30,000. I know. It's like, and yes, clear communication. And what else? Oh, yes. And I guess I think that's probably, looking at the market is probably the most important thing. And just being aware very much of what the press does, which we've already covered. But because there'll be, for example, we don't do poetry. We don't. There'll be a whole bunch of stuff that we don't do, and so it's a waste of everybody's time if translators don't do that. I think there'll be a question later about how flexible.
Yes. Yeah. So Just to follow up on that, when you're saying that you would like translators to provide comp titles for the UK and US market, at what stage would you prefer that? Is it during the pitching, or is it during the, when you're about to come up with the marketing publicity plan?
During the pitching. Basically, exactly what we did for the pen thing, right? So, and also then it puts the book in particular context, etc. And marketing is everything. I mean, everyone in this room knows. You can publish a book, but it's how do you get the voice out? How do you get it discovered, etc. And so, yes, actually, at the pitching stage, definitely.
Thank you. Okay. Kristen, because you have the mic, you can go.
Sure, I would agree with marketing. I actually wrote that down and then erased it because I thought to myself, what am I asking of people? But it's true. It's really, really helpful. And I don't know, it makes me think a lot about when I was in academia and all of a sudden you weren't just expected to know what you were researching, you were expected to do admin, you were just expected to do so much more than what you thought you were getting into. I think this is a bit similar.
Definitely, yeah.
You can speak more about that.
No, I mean, yeah, I think, Anton said it, the actual translating part of being a translator is so much smaller than everything else you're expected to do.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then I guess for me, my answers would kind of bleed into best practice. So I don't know if you want me to get into that. Dan wants to.
No, you can get into that, and then we'll come, to Dan.
Sure. And okay, I'm going to say this, but I always work in some time for delays. So punctuality
Okay.
is kind of a thing that is helpful. But I definitely understand life gets in the way. And not being afraid to ask questions throughout the process, whether it's to the publishing house or other translators. Everyone has questions, including myself. I'm constantly learning from mistakes, and like really grateful to the community around me, and understanding your rights as a translator. I think that this is super important and really appreciated. And then simultaneously understanding the labor rights and the work of the publishing house. And, it's the way that we're funded or the way that, people work with us. It is complex, and it is because there is very little money in this. And that independent publishing really, really differs from corporate publishing. So don't have the same expectations, is what I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah, I also had this kind of point. I didn't have comping necessarily, but I had pitching down as kind of a key skill that's kind of, it's hard, you're continuing to learn how to pitch, right? But I think the work of comping is quite important. I mean, when it comes to me reading a submission, I'll then have to kind of work out a pitch for myself, which I'll have to pitch to an editorial team, and then to an acquisitions team, and then to a sales team, before that sales team is then pitching it to the general public. So if you're beginning to do that work before the work has even entered the publishing house, that's extremely helpful, and also gives us a very clear idea of where that work is kind of sitting. I think quite often there's the kind of tendency, maybe this is unfair, it feels like there's a tendency to think of the original work as a kind of piece of intellectual property, a piece of IP. And quite often when I'm pitched work, it will be, this has sold 50,000 copies in whichever country, which of course is good to know. It's nice to know that it's resonating in that country. But so rarely is that the thing that makes me go, ooh, I'm going to read this now. More often than not, it's how that work is being spoken about, how it's being pitched. Okay. So yeah, and I think that's a really key skill. Also speaking to not assuming, I mean, it's slightly different when kind of publishing houses have a kind of more specific focus in the kind of languages and countries that they're kind of working from. But certainly Granta, our remit is quite broad in translated fiction, and not assuming that I know what's going on in any given country is also really, it sounds like a kind of silly point, but I am really energized by the conversations I have where an author is speaking about an author within a particular context or within a particular literary mode or scene, and kind of I find that those conversations extremely helpful and interesting.
Situating, yeah, importance of situating the author. And any other best practice, because we've kind of bled into our next question, which was best practice from translators. We've talked about pitching, situating, punctuality, knowing your rights as a translator, having realistic expectations of the publishing house. Anything either you or Archna would like to add to that?
I guess the only other thing, and we haven't done this for translations to date, but it would be great if one of the things that we are beginning to look out for is having authors who have more than one book, because it just decreases our time and acquisition costs, quite frankly, and it's probably better for the translator also. So if you have an author who's got 2 or 3 books, and we can apply for funding for the whole series, or that I think is going to be our sort of modus operandi going forward. We're absolutely happy to accept one-off books, but I'm just saying that actually for brand building and just for ease of the business, actually, if we have that's really, really helpful.
Okay, so my next question is, I'm curious about, once a translator submits a translated manuscript in each of your houses, because I imagine the process will be relatively similar, but also slightly different. What happens, so I email in the manuscript, and then who's looking at it? What are the stages? And I'm particularly curious about, do you ever have someone who is familiar with the source language looking at the manuscript? Because I know, having attended different workshops with translators working in French and Spanish, this tends to be a sort of commonplace occurrence where the either acquiring editor or someone else on the team has the language of the source manuscript, whereas with Arabic, that is very, very rare indeed. So yeah, if you can take us through your editing process, please. And we could start with maybe Kristen. Thank you.
Sure. So it is either edited in-house or we hire a freelance editor. We've been going through a lot of changes, so that's kind of why it's a little bit of both at this point. There usually is a first, second, sometimes third round of structural edits between the editor and translator. I usually kind of budget maybe a year prior to publication. Then after the structural editing, copy edits, and the translator will respond to any questions, and that is a different editor. And then it's typeset, and then it's proofread by, again, someone else. And if necessary, the translator will respond. And then who's reading it in the process? Myself. And then the editor and the publicist, hopefully. And again, it's all I really wish I could pay more people for their reading time. So that is also something to keep in mind in general. That's why excerpts are usually helpful as well. And I'm not sure. And then I don't know if you were just kind of speaking to those kind of very technical or logistical, just if there are small corrections that need to be made, hopefully they'll be made in the second printing. Hopefully there are none.
Yeah, I mean, the editing process itself is very similar for us at Granta. We're entirely in-house editors. I can't think, we've had one instance recently due to kind of an extra title sitting during a maternity cover in which we outsourced an editing job, but 99% of the time it happens internally because we're a slightly bigger editorial team, I suppose. The process in the lead up to that, or the process of acquisition, is one in which we have French speakers in-house, maybe I think a German speaker as well, but that's kind of it. So our process is very much one of, we'll receive a sample translation and pitch from which we'll kind of form an idea of whether it's something we want to pursue or not. And then we will always source one reader report, 9 times out of 10, 2 reader reports, before the work is even circulated for an editorial meeting. So that will happen. The editor who's received the submission will make the decision to do that. Once they've received those reports, provided they reflect, they say the work is good, they go to an editorial meeting, at which point the editorial team at large will read the material that we have that now includes these 2 reader reports and discuss whether it's something we want to publish. Once it's got through that stage, it will go to an acquisitions meeting, at which point the entirety of the campaigns team, so publicity, sales, marketing, and rights, though depends whether we actually get rights in the title or not, will weigh in on whether that's a publishing proposition that we wish to pursue, and then from that point, we'll try and buy the book.
I'm just curious, when it gets to the acquisitions meeting, you know, obviously without naming books or titles, could you give us some examples of reasons why books have been shot down? You know, I once, for example, pitched to Penguin Classics, and the acquiring editor was very keen on the book. It went to the general meeting, then the acquisitions meeting, and the marketing team shot it down because they said that the author is a recluse who lives in a very small village in France, and the book is too long and nobody knows her. But they gave me that feedback, which is really helpful, and I went ahead to like pitch other titles to them, right, like shorter ones. But I'm just, I'm just saying that I'm just curious. Yeah, what are some possible reasons that the book could be, you know, just disregarded?
Yeah, well, for a work in translation, I mean, funding is quite a key one in that. It's a conversation that comes up in an editorial meeting, but it's usually for an acquisitions meeting. Once we've kind of got a temperature gauge of the team at large and ensuring that everyone's kind of behind the title, we will put together a profit and loss form, which is kind of our way of working out whether a book is going to break even, which is usually the focus, if not make profit. And that's where the kind of information about translation grants really comes in, because they will be kind of key to that. So that's a key reason why things go, but also more simply just the team has to be behind it. Like, we are bigger than these guys, but we're not a huge team, and the list is still fairly boutique, and there's just a need for all of those. Everyone's got to be behind all of those books in order for them to work. So that's the most common reason, really, I would say. Occasionally there'll be something to do with, you know, is the author a good spokesperson for their work, etc. Can they do events in the English language? Can we do events with the translator? Where's the translator based? These sorts of questions do come up, but not so regularly. You know, I think that's a question that will come up more at a corporate publishing house than an independent, typically, but not exclusively.
So ours is a little bit more streamlined, simply because we're small. we're growing really fast. It's actually just me, but we've just hired another senior editor who is a French to English translator also. So we rely very much on the translators submitting enough information for essentially me to like the book. It's I always get on the phone, so whether it's an English book that we're acquiring or in translation, I will always set up a call where I'm talking to someone face to face about the book to get a sense. I guess if there isn't enough marketing information in their pitch, I'll send them our form, our submissions form, and they can fill that out in a bit more detail. But yes, it's a really sensitive thing about, can the author speak English? And we've had, one of our authors we thought was going to get interviewed on radio for one of these, the program anyway, but it was shot down even though we could have provided an interpreter. And we don't want to go down that route, because the whole point about translations is that people don't have to speak English. But from a marketing perspective, it really is something to consider. So then and I think we might be covering this, so I don't want to sort of overlap. So then the onus becomes on the translator. Is the translator willing to step up and help us market the book? But yeah, so in terms of, so I will make a decision, and we will absolutely need to apply for a translation grant. So I will work very closely with the translator to put one together. And then in terms of the actual editorial process, so generally I or the senior editor will do that first round of edits, and we'll send it to the translator, who will then send it to the author. And actually it's great, this is what we look out for translators. We've had sort of bad experience, and then we've had fantastic experience where we end up copy editing the text just like we would do an English text. And if there are certain additions to do, obviously in the voice of the author, absolutely true to the material, etc., we really appreciate a translator who's willing to look at that, and a publishing house who's willing to look at that and not look at everything as a very literal translation. So I won't tell you the language, but we had one book where, the author was considered sort of, demigod in the country, and so they were unwilling to change the ending, etc., etc. And so it's a great translation, but you know what? It would have been better, and we'd come up with it. So it's that kind of stuff that we look out for. And so once we've done that so between the translator, author, and internally at Neem Press, we've come to what we regard as a final book. We will then always send it out to an outside copy editor, because we always find that incredibly valuable. And then, of course, you typeset the book and you proofread it. And the big thing, of course, that is a cover design. And that's really important because, titles are not, titles are, you have to really think about what title you want the translation to be. Is it reflective of the book? So, we do a lot of historical fiction. So, the creative brief is really important, and we want to have, obviously, the translator involved in that creative brief, particularly if the author doesn't speak English. But often we'll just translate the creative brief for the author, and they will put it in there. I'm sorry, I use Google Translate for some of this stuff because it's just so much easier to do. But yes, that's our process.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to say two things. And one was that it was really exciting to be a part of the creative brief discussion when we were doing Jin's Apple and see the mood board. I love mood boards. And so it was just like, oh, yeah, we go in this direction or in that direction. And so that was very inspiring and fun. And the other thing is in the past two books that I have submitted, this is just, Jessica Cohen's talk yesterday really just kind of boosted my morale, because the source text is becoming more and more elastic with every book I'm turning in. There's always, wanting either the author to rewrite the ending, or to add in a few scenes here, or to tighten up the tension in this particular part of the book. And I thought it was only happening with Arabic, but I talked to a few other translators here, and it's also happening in their languages. And so, it's also a question of how far do you go and the ethics of that. But just something to keep in mind. Before we,
Can I just add?
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't.
Please.
We don't have someone who knows the source language at the endpoint look over the text. So I just wanted to add that. And also, when we acquire world English language rights to a book, and then we end up, like Granta, selling it to a North American publishing house, sometimes that publishing house will want to edit. And so again, I'm just going back to expectations. Set those out and have conversations from the beginning, because their editor is different from us, and the US market is different from the UK market, and the expectations that we have. And I just think that's really important.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
It's a fun game every time I go with the mic. Sorry, we're still turning off the mic. That's what's happening there. What was I going to say? Oh, about the elastic source text. Yeah, it's definitely a thing. Again, I won't name languages. Maybe that's the best way to do this.
Yes.
But publishing houses in different languages will work in different ways, and the editorial process in some languages is looser than it is in the English language. And so I think I did have as one of my misconceptions, but I didn't mention it, that it's only a line edit, because it's just so rarely only a line edit. I've had conversations with authors in translation who've said that they've preferred or have really enjoyed the process of being edited in the English language, because they've had a more rigorous edit through it. So I think the elasticity of the source text is definitely a big thing.
Wow. Yes.
Yes, and in terms of elasticity, particularly with historical fiction, we love maps. So often the original book will not have a map, we always wrestle with glossaries. Do we put one in? Do we not? Do we put any sort of end notes that explain the historical era, etc.? And that is always, it's not exactly a fraught discussion, but a careful discussion to be had. But yes, but maps are always, and those are pretty uncontroversial, I think, and always fun.
Thank you. Okay, our last question before we get to Q&A. So I'm giving you, a heads up so you can ask your own questions, is, and we touched upon this a little bit, but maybe if you can think of some concrete examples for us, how translators have, taken part or decided not to in the publicity and marketing of titles. While you're thinking, I'll give some examples of my own in terms of, interpreting for an author at a book club, which unfortunately is not paid. This is the issue, right? A lot of it is not paid. But because I was getting royalties from the first copy on this particular book, I said, sure, I'll do it because the entire book club is buying the book, right? So you have to kind of think about that. And, I guess I just wanted to give you some time to think. Yeah.
So actually the first book that we published, a while ago when I knew nothing about publishing, was actually, we published the Arabic first. It was called Ismi al-Haraki Farasha by Ahlam Basharat. And then we did the translation in English, and it's titled Codename Butterfly. And the editor on that book was Ruth Ahmadzai Kemp. And of course, Ahlam does not have a passport of convenience. It is incredibly difficult for her to come out of Palestine. And we managed to get on the short list for the Palestine Book Awards, and so we managed to get her over here. She got a visa, etc. And Ruth was amazing. So it was all touch and go. She'd ended up in Jordan, and they wouldn't let her back. I mean, it was all a nightmare. We didn't know whether she was going to come. The last minute, she did. And Ruth just put together this amazing book tour. I mean, a physical book tour where we traipsed around the UK for a week, and that was amazing. And then she also, this is right at the beginning, she helped set up my social media. I mean, she went way above. I would not expect a translator to do that now at all. But it was a great start to, a relationship with a translator and see how involved they were, both just from a, very emotional but also very pragmatic perspective. So I would say that was, really good. And we've had translators along the way. So we've had, for the Romanian book, it wasn't actually the translator per se, although no, James Brown, he did a lot of online events with us, but then there was also an interpreter that the author knew, and so the three of them together, we did a book launch online where Doina had her own interpreter in Romania, and I had an interpreter here, so it was seamless. So it was simultaneous translation, so everything was seamless for the viewer. So, there's lots of different ways that we worked with translators.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I think just going back to the question is like how much of a role and what do we expect translators to do in terms of publicizing the book? For us, it's as much as you're comfortable with, and to keep in mind that a lot of it isn't paid work, but as a press, we're going to try, and so as Dan mentioned, LTI Korea does fund tours. And they just funded a recent one with Anton and Sangyang. And so I think, I thought a lot about structural change when I was at the Barbican and how to go about doing this. And it would lead to budgets. And so I say this because we incorporated fees for both the translator and the author in the events. Within our application for the grant. And I would just encourage you to maybe speak to publishers. LTI Korea funded 80% of the tour and we did 20%. But it really kind of comes down to what you ask for. And I asked this time around for higher interpreter fees, which are really, really important. So that's one example. And we are looking for more funding. If anyone has any recommendations, we have a big kind of tour coming up in October, and that is, I bring this up because it differs per book, and this one we have to do it. like Yumiri is our and Morgan, they're our biggest selling books, and this book is particularly epic. So they'll be doing 3 different dates in October. But again, just like Love in the Big City and the end of August, they're all out of time. And I often say this when I'm at panels, is that we have to publish our books out of linear time, just because, in a lot of ways, because of funding. It is, most of our authors don't live in the UK, most of our translators don't live in the UK, so it's very expensive for us to put on a tour. And so we have to think about publicity and marketing really creatively, and we're still trying to do that and learning as we go along. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think even though it is out of time, the recent response you had to the book tour with Anton on was, I think, speaks volumes that so many people still showed up, even though the book was
Sold
published
out.
a while ago. So I think that's pretty great. Dan, yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got a huge amount to add, to be honest. I mean, the publicity for any given book varies, whether that's in translation or not. The costs are a big thing. It depends where a translator is based. If they're based in the UK, of course, we're going to get them involved in lots of ways. If we secure kind of like, print publicity for an author, be that a feature or an interview or something like that, we sometimes get the translator who's worked on the book involved, if they want to be, in kind of translating that work, which is sometimes funded by us, sometimes funded by the publication, or a mixture of both. But yeah, kind of funding pots, such as translation grants, quite often include kind of publicity funding, so that it does hinge on that to some extent. So yeah.
We've also had, so we got a Romanian Cultural Institute grant for our Romanian translation. And I have to say, they were amazing. So they did a physical book launch in the Belgravia headquarters. And it's a glorious room with sort of like, faded paintings. Honestly, it was like so. And they did a hybrid event, and they had, drinks and, all kinds of Romanian cultural stuff. And they created this big coach, because in the Book of Hairless Dishes, there's this coach that takes her from one place to another. I mean, they had really gone out of town. So I think that depending on where you get the funding from and how enthusiastic they are, and of course the translator, unfortunately James couldn't come over, but he was hybrid, so he was online, which was fantastic.
That's amazing, just to say.
Yeah, a coach.
We got some wine from an embassy once, and we were like, yes, what a win.
I feel like I need to start translating from Romanian. Okay, opening it up to Q&A. Yeah, I think we have a roving mic. Thank you so much. Ooh, okay. Great, good to see all the hands up. Yes.
What about the challenges and greatest joys questions? Are we out of time?
No, we're not out of time. I thought maybe, okay, well, I just thought, I didn't know if you want to get into that. Yeah, I had sent them
I want to know.
Okay. Sorry, before the Q&A, yeah, challenges and greatest joys was one of the questions I had sent.
I think you want to go first.
No, I said I want to hear. I want to hear from you. Can I not go first?
Okay.
Okay, cool. I mean, funding is one of the greatest challenges, as you may have picked up from this conversation.
Yeah.
And I think more specifically, I find the challenge between, for me, balancing my work between pursuing avenues where there's an existing infrastructure, and I can kind of safely assume if I'm pursuing certain work, there are funding avenues available to me, versus one where I kind of know from the outset that funding is going to be extremely difficult.
Right.
And kind of the challenge of weighing up, because you don't want to ignore those other avenues, but you've got to kind of weigh up time, essentially. The other challenge I have is knowing when to let a book go.
Oh.
In the kind of submission process, which happens with, every book, regardless of the language, but particularly when you're working with external readers, because there is just always that question in the back of your head of, is it the book or is it the reader? And it doesn't gel with them. Hence why we so often do the kind of 2 reader reports, because we seek some form of balance. So yeah, I'd say they're kind of like 2 of the central, challenges. In terms of joys, on the flip side of the kind of with the reader report thing, I enjoy it as a process of decentralization. I really enjoy that translation work decenters us as publishing houses. You know, like sure, a decision is being made by me, but a decision is being made by me informed by people outside of the publishing house and not just within it. And I think that's a really lovely kind of more collaborative working process. I mean, I guess just broadly, I also still hold on to translated literature as, like, I don't know, coming from a working class upbringing, definitely not having traveled so much, I just hold translated literature as a space in which to travel. And that doesn't necessarily mean I want the literature to reflect the place that it's coming from, although sometimes that's nice, but it's a sensibility, it's a mood, it's an aesthetic. And yeah, that's a huge joy.
I love that. Thank you. Okay. Okay, all right, she wants to hear from you first.
Look, I can go
I just sat on a really great challenge.
Marketing really is the biggest challenge, and I think that again, it's language. It's, you know, what can we expect realistically from the author in their target language? Because, you know, the way that marketing generally works is you'll be asked, you know, all the themes that an author can write on, and then they, you know, create content, and you send that to the magazine, and at the bottom of that content there'll be, oh, and they published a book. That's at the stage that we are at as a publisher. It's very unlikely that certainly a national press will review our book per se, so we will have to provide free content or have someone provide free content, and at the end of it there'll be a little thing. So obviously an author who doesn't speak English, it is not fair. I mean, they can't do that. So then we have to find, you know, exactly as Kristen said, sort of creative ways that we can, you know, we can market the book. So that is probably the biggest challenge. So funding you can kind of sort of cope with, because, you know, sadly, does that mean that you forego some languages? Because, and that's I think that's the problem sometimes with funding. It drives you down certain avenues when possibly you'd want to pursue others. But, you know, that's life and that's business at the end of the day. But marketing is probably the most important. And in terms of joys, I mean, exactly, Dan, it's just discovering. It's just a voice that just speaks to you, and either a geography or an era or something that really transports you is always amazing. And also working with great translators is amazing. I mean, it really is. And discovering authors, and, you know, all because of the science, we are almost all our authors. Even in, well, no, not in translation. I was going to say all the ones in English are debut, but not in translation. So actually, all of our authors in translation are, they're pretty established. So that's a different thing. So.
Thank you. Okay, last but not least, Kristen.
Sorry, this feels like, oh gosh, it kind of, I had a flashback to watching my aunties try to pay. You know, do you ever, like, you know, they argue so much about who's going to pay, and it's like, yeah, sorry, that was where that's coming from. But challenges, I agree with all of what everyone has said. Time, sustainability, money. I wish that we wouldn't have to worry so much about those things. So that's, you know, that's always the biggest challenges. But in terms of the greatest joys, I think that it's a really exciting time for translated literature, but there's still so much work to be done. And one of the greatest joys is that, like, that space of work to be done, because it isn't done yet. So we can imagine what it is that we want to do and how it is that we want to bring literature into, you know, particular markets. You know, we are always going to be working against the history of English literature and canons, but English readers are not just familiar with English literature, right? Like, our biggest market, I would say, is the diasporas. And the kind of different, like, actually before the panel, Jeremy was telling me about, like, this really wonderful community of translators of color in New York, and I don't know, it's really, a time for community and consciousness. And I'm borrowing this from a title of like a day panel that I'm going to next Friday. I didn't come up with that, but I do think about, like, there's a particular consciousness that I have when thinking about translated literature and publishing it. And it's also kind of an awareness of where you are. So here in the UK, I don't want it to feel like extracting. I'm very conscious of that, like extracting culture and bringing it into the UK. So collaboration is another one of my greatest joys. Yeah, so just being able to speak and learn from others.
What a wonderful note, I think, for us to end on before we open up to the Q&A, consciousness and community. Okay, yes, now is the real Q&A. Yeah. Just getting you warmed up there before. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for that. That was really interesting. I filled almost my whole notebook. Just got an easy question to start off with. Talking about external readers, how do you recruit people to do readers' reports?
It's on. I mean, I have the benefit of having joined an editorial team who's been doing a lot of translation work for a lot of years, and there are a huge number of relationships with translators that predate me, with my colleagues Laura Barber or Anne Meadows, who no longer works at Granta but used to. And so I work very closely with those kind of pre-existing relationships. Or it's, you know, people who I meet at London Book Fair, or people who have been recommended. The recommendations thing is a huge thing. And I mean, also, but there are instances where I was seeking a report for something written in the Yiddish quite recently. We didn't have a Yiddish reader on our records, and so I approached an academic and said, can you recommend some people? And kind of went down that avenue. And similarly, Romanian, we had like a Romanian reader on our books who I approached and was unavailable to do it, but they had a whole like Romanian translators WhatsApp group or Facebook group or whatever it was that several recommendations came from. So yeah.
We don't do readers' reports. We might change that as we grow, but we rely very much on the translator and on the description and on the sample translation. So we absolutely cannot take a translation on if we don't have a decent sample translation in English. So that's what we do.
Okay, Kristen says she just seconds that. Okay.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Do you have like a, throwing the structure out of the window, do you have like a set length of sample that you need to have to consider it if you're not using reader reports?
Sometimes it's a chapter to a couple of short stories. Those are maybe 30 pages, 15 to 30, but we often get lesser than that. And it always depends on like money, right? So if you don't have money to translate the sample, you don't necessarily, maybe you shouldn't be doing that. Yeah, so there isn't a set length is basically what I'm trying to say. And then if you go back to the kind of trust and your body of work, that also helps when thinking about a shorter sample.
Yeah, did you?
Yeah, no, I would second that. It helps to have a really good synopsis where you know the ending, because, you know, that's always the crux of the matter, right? So a book may start off really well, but then when you get to the ending, you're like, okay. So it's always good to actually have a synopsis that gives you the spoilers.
Okay, thank you.
Hi there. Thank you so much for this panel. I was wondering, kind of continuing on the theme of collaborative work, I feel like that's been a kind of a recurring theme in BCLT this year. You know, we've heard some from, you know, Jessica Cohen about, you know, translation as a dialogue between writer and translator. Yesterday we heard from, you know, Slyn, Anton, Claire, and Paige on, you know, co-translation. So I was wondering, speaking of kind of co-translation, when you're receiving a pitch, is that something that excites you? That, you know, if maybe a pitch is coming from people who already are hoping to work together as co-translators, would you encourage it? Are there any specific thoughts you have around that?
Yes, definitely encourage it. I think that translation can be a very lonely process. I'm not a translator, but I think that we appreciate, and that sense of creativity and that sense of getting it just right is not an easy one to do, I think. And so, again, it was actually for our book, Trees for the Absentees, which was another Arabic to English translation. It was co-translations, and I think that they both fed off each other really well. They already knew each other well. They'd worked together really well. So I think, yeah, I mean, we're fine with co or not co, but we totally understand why co may work very well for some translators. Absolutely.
Well, I agree with that, but it's funny that when you first asked the question, I was like, does it excite me? I all of a sudden think about rights, and I think about costs. So
And
it's
payment.
interesting. But it is, in theory, it's very exciting. But it's not necessarily something that we personally look out for.
Yeah, I'd echo this exactly. I think it's nice. I think it's also it serves as a good means of a kind of a more established translator, perhaps working with someone who's getting their first or second full-length translation. I think that's really nice. It also works really well with. We had quite recently with a book that was written kind of like part in dialect that one of the other translators didn't read so well, so it worked well in that way. I would quite often look for why there's a co-translation. Probably to kind of help answer the question when I get asked regarding costs. So yeah.
That's actually really helpful to hear. I guess logistically speaking and practically speaking, I was curious, are there any reasons to not do that, to avoid it? Or maybe just add that to the pitch of adding that layer of justification.
I think adding the layer of justification is helpful, kind of understanding what the cost that would be involved, because I actually don't know.
I was just going to say, I've done 4 co-translations and only one on one of them, which was with Amazon Crossing, you'd get a separate fee. Otherwise, every other one, it was half the fee. So if I could do co-translation on every title, I would, because I absolutely love it, but it's not sustainable for me or my family. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's very rare that you'll get a separate fee as a co-translator.
What about the royalties?
The royalties, we've also split them. So I get, so it's like, for example, like 1.5 and 1.5. Or, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
And also it depends on the process, right? Because what you don't want to do, if you have co-translators, does that mean that both of them are going to be doing the work twice? And so in other words, actually they won't spend any less time. So the question is, what's the value for the co-translators to be doing co? And actually, is it just going to end up making the process slower for everyone or not? So that's a really practical consideration, because I think, Kristen, you said about funding, the way that funding works, it's actually ridiculous. So in an ideal setting, you want the book to be ready 6 months pre-publication, particularly for the US market, which has had even longer lead times for marketing a book. And often, and certainly I won't tell you, but anyway, there was a grant, which meant that we basically couldn't recoup our costs that we should have done because it fell out of the timeline, because we had to get the book ready in advance of, so it was a bit complicated. So I think that it just, you don't want to take away streamlining of the process, basically, because deadlines have to be stuck to. Yeah. So.
I was just going to say sometimes co-translation speeds things up. Yeah, that's actually on 2 books. That's why we did it, because I didn't want to drop the book, and I was like, "Hey, do you want to do this with me? You're my friend." Yeah, let's get it done. Did you want to add something, Dan? I thought you were.
Not massively. I mean, I think the cost thing comes down to royalties and whether a translator might argue for slightly higher royalties because they're going to have taken a hit if it's a co-translation. Mm-hmm. It might also come from I don't know. I just feel like the translation fee also accounts for the kind of editing process. And if you're taking like half the money from the translation fee, you're doing that editing process. That's a huge amount of time for like much less money. And sure, you're working with someone else on it, but you're still involved in that project for a long time. So I don't know, I feel like the costs come from a translator stating quite rightly what they would like and us having to weigh up whether it's worth it or not.
I mean, from a pragmatic perspective, if you've got two great translators who know how to market, that's fabulous, right? Because then you have 3 people going out in the market, or 4 people with a publisher. So, yeah.
Also something for me to push next time. Okay. Yeah, please, if our roving mics could rove further afield. Thank you.
Hi, hello, and thank you very much. My question will be quite specific, but I hope it's okay. Because 2 of you mentioned comparables, book comparables, and this is a concept that I kind of understand, but it's also quite new to me. So I wonder if you could give a little bit more detail of how are the comparables actually helpful for you in the process of bookmaking, and is it more about the books that are similar in plot, in voice, or maybe appealing to the same audiences? How do we approach that to make it useful for you, and how is it actually useful? Thank you.
Well, I mean, that's a very broad question, and I feel like that's a conversation that happens within the publishing industry at large, is how and when is comping helpful? Because, I mean, there is a world in which it is extremely helpful. You say a novel is probing X themes like Y novel has done previously, or the voice has X quality, much like Y author. And, you're speaking very specifically to what that work is doing. The work of comping also can quite often get bound up in sales expectations. This novel is like this novel, therefore we can expect it to sell around this amount, which sometimes is helpful, sometimes isn't. And so, I mean, for your purposes, I think it's about situating it in the market. And I mean, there are countless examples of unhelpful comping. This is a Dutch novel, therefore it's like The Discomfort of Evening. And you're like, well, no, there's far less. Yeah, it's not the same as The Discomfort of Evening. But yeah, I think I always find it helpful if someone's kind of really honing in on like what it is that makes it speak to those novels, and kind of use it as a kind of like triangulation effort to some extent, if that's helpful.
So it's about discoverability, right? So where's that novel going to sit in a bookshop? So when the consumer goes in to buy the book, and so what's their readership? So it's for us anyway, it is very much a market and sales discussion. And sales teams are under extreme pressure because there are literally, I mean, translated or not translated, books in general, they're a discretionary spend, unlike, health and all the rest of it. And so it's really how do you make sure that that book is going to be placed in the right bookshelf and be put in front of the right readers, and have, and from a sales team's perspective, they are more likely to be enthusiastic about selling a book if they feel that it is comparable to another well-selling book in the recent past. So it's no point going back, beyond 3 years, because that they don't care about that. And so that's where it's important.
Anything to add? Thank you.
No, just for us, it's mainly marketing and sales where it's helpful. I don't think it's actually necessarily helpful to us in the publishing house, if that makes any sense. It's not really how how I came into the role, and like what would have been discussed. But then I find our sales team will often find that helpful.
Great. Thank you for that question.
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel. My question is regarding the role of the translator while pitching. If let's assume that the editor likes the pitch, and what kind of a help would you want from the translator for your in-house pitching to other departments, or the translator's role stops there, and then when the book comes out, that's where the translator again gets into the picture for marketing and other, publicizing the events and those kind of activities?
So I guess we're a little different because the acquisition process is just much not shorter necessarily because there's a backlog, etc. But certainly there aren't many layers to go through. But we do want for example, the creative brief. So let's say that we've accepted the book. So for us, it's a fairly streamlined position whether we're going to take the book on or not. But we would like the translator to be involved with figuring out cover design. So we're unusual in the sense that we involve our authors and translators quite actively. So they will actually fill out the creative brief first for the design work, and then we will, of course, do a much more detailed sort of overview of that. And we would like their help in developing marketing plans. So now, because we're growing and we're putting stuff in place, we want to have a marketing plan developed very, very early on in the process. So that includes, figuring out, things that perhaps are already established houses don't need to think about, but we do. What are the podcasts? What are the programs? What are the special, what are the local presses or regional presses or whatever that we can get involved with? And so that's always really helpful for a translator to get their input on that. That's about key. Yeah.
I mean, with regards to kind of the pitching in-house, kind of minimal, I would say. You've done your job by making us alert to it. I mean, occasionally we'll have the questions maybe specifically about funding, or another specific question might come out of an editorial meeting. But for the most part, it's then for me or whichever editor is kind of championing it in-house to try and get it over the line. And it's rare that we'd kind of turn and ask you to contribute to that. Not least because it's kind of unpaid labor as well, right? It's asking you to do our jobs for us. So yeah, minimal.
Thank you. And Kristen? Yeah.
I think there's more involvement in cover design for us, and as we continue to kind of do changes with who we're working with, I think input is really helpful because again, it's also very personal to you and the writer and the author. So we'd love to have your input. And again, I would just say, going back to thinking about your expectations and how much you want to be involved, it does help to have input in marketing, but it's not something that we would ask you to attend. And yeah, if you want to, I think it's important to kind of think about that and how much labor you want to put in, and what kind of press is that you're publishing with.
I just wanted to second that. So I think where cover design input is important is for general sensitivity. So with the Jin's Apple, we had, does the protagonist wear a hijab on the front of the cover or not? So we went through a couple of designs. So it's things like that, really. It's making sure, like for any book, really, making sure that we've got the cultural sensitivities right, if that's what the cover requires. So it's always good to get another read on something like that.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for like 1 to 2 more questions, and then there's so many, which is so. Oh yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much for that. Kind of building on that question, I wanted to ask, in your experience, what's the translator's role been in the editorial process in the various stages of editing? Would you be kind of sending the translator your edits to review and approve and sort of working collaboratively with them? And is that the same for copy edits and proofreads? And also, does the author ever get involved with the translator be feeding back your edits to the author too?
Okay, so just so we can try to get through more questions, I'm going to ask just one person to answer each of the questions. So if one of you can pick this up, then we'll jump to the next question. So the role of the translator during the editing process.
Key, absolutely. So that we'll get the translation, we'll go through it, we'll put notes, into it, flip it over to the translator. They will then liaise with the author, and how you do that is. That's where a lot of time can be lost because there's, language issues, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, at every stage, not proofreading. Generally, no, that should be done by someone unrelated, who hasn't seen the text before, ideally. So.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, moving on to another question. Yeah. Great. Oh, sorry. Okay, you can go after Paige. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the insights you've shared. I'm still thinking about a comment made earlier about trying to acquire authors rather than novels individually. And as a translator who usually works with newer, younger writers, I'm wondering what in a pitch would incentivize you to look into newer, younger writers without a huge repertoire of books. And before you say funding, I do translate from a pretty well-funded language. So excluding that, what other things might incentivize you to take on a new writer with potential?
Yeah, I think it was me who made that comment, so I'll jump on this one. I mean, obviously it's a dream if you encounter a writer who's of some standing, who has this huge backlist of fantastic novels that haven't been translated, and you can be involved in that work. But actually by that comment, I didn't necessarily mean that they had to be an established writer. I think it's more, there are some books that you'll read on submission and you'll say, this is an author, this is a voice and a distinctive voice. And obviously you have no idea what that author is going to go on to do. So you're kind of guessing to some extent, but you're kind of captivated by the voice itself. And then there are other submissions that you read that you might think, oh, the writing here is fine, but the idea is good, or I can see this kind of the pitch of this novel cutting through. And that's the kind of like difference I'm talking about mostly. Like there are plenty of submissions that you get through that you're like, oh, this could be published and it could do well, I think. But am I interested in what this author is going to go on to next? So I don't think it necessarily has to be an established author. It's more just the voice itself grabbing you as much as that particular novel. If that works.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, we had the gentleman in the back with the...
Yeah, so I was wondering how far your decision on acquiring a manuscript depend on expectations from your sales accounts or retail distributors and partners, because I always felt there is some feedback coming in from that side. And do we have to be very, when we choose to translate a certain work, and pitch, and when it comes to pitching?
Well, for us, it's pretty simple because it doesn't necessarily doesn't weigh too much, even though I'm constantly thinking about sales and money. That's not how we acquire.
I would say that's kind of the case with a lot of the independents, is that they are editorially led. Like sales are obviously an important part of that process. And speaking as someone who comes from the sales background, I know that. But it's not, the editorial like freedom to kind of like acquire and to buck trends as well is really important. Like if you were, this is the kind of like the danger of the comping thing, right? You can quite easily fall into a cul-de-sac of publishing because you're overly reliant on the comps, and you've got to have that editorial instinct to kind of rub up against the sales. So it should always be a friction.
Yeah, and for us, I'd say that we don't have the money to subscribe to BookScan data, for example. So it's a little bit pie in the sky to figure out. So no, like both Kristen and Dan, that's not how we acquire. It's going to be editorial led. Yeah.
Okay, I just feel really bad because there are like all these great questions and I know we're running over. Okay, Will says we can keep going. Okay, yeah, so if we could continue to pass the mic round, otherwise I can also give mine. Thank you.
I have a question about short stories. I've been told that short story collections are hard to pitch, so I'm wondering what tips do you have to make it more attractive to publishers?
Okay, so we have recently decided to go for short stories. So we are branding our short stories with illustrations. So that's, we're trying to create something a little bit special, a little bit different. But in terms of what we look for is, exactly as has been said before, a voice that is just something different, zany, quirky, challenging. Yeah, that's what we're looking for. So we don't know. The jury's out because our first short story collection will be published. It's actually Arabic to English translation. We're doing it in English also. So we'll watch this space in a couple of years' time and see where we are with that. But yes, it is challenging to market. It's challenging also to sell rights for short stories, even from English into other languages. I say even, but from English, and therefore it's probably even harder from other languages into English. But I think if a short story collection has a particular theme that resonates, and a voice at the end of the day, we're absolutely willing to look at them. Yeah.
Okay, I've been given the signal. We need to draw the curtain back. So, any final comments from Dan and Kristen before we move on to Will? Yeah. Anything you want to say about short stories or?
Well, we love short stories.
Okay.
And most recently, Norman Erickson Pasaribu's Happy Stories Mostly, translated by Tiffany Tsao, is longlisted for the International Booker in 2022. So, and we have quite a few more coming up, including Jeremy's Delicious Hunger is a short story collection. So pitch them. For us, it's about good writing and everything that Archna said.
And it won the Republic of Consciousness Prize.
Oh yes, it won that. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
When you said concluding thoughts, I thought you just meant on translation.
Yeah,
and I was like, no. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we do a feast and famine movement with short stories where we'll be yeah, get them in. And then there'll be a moment where it's kind of oh, we've got a lot of short stories now. So we have to kind of slow it down again. But I mean, yeah, it's definitely worth pitching. It also relates to this question about pitching early career authors. That's quite often what you're working with. And if the voice is distinctive enough, we will 100% take it on, yeah.
Okay, I'll just say one thing though. If a short story collection is too short, we're not interested. So it has to be long enough. It has to be, for us anyway, it has to be, 50 to 60,000, right? So sometimes we'll say, we'll get a short story collection in and we'll say, oh, can we get another one? Can we get another short story in there? And generally, depending on who the author is, etc., that's usually doable.
You're sneaking in something, yeah.
Just because it's a very practical thing and goes back to big books cost a lot of money. So that is something to keep in mind when you're thinking about a profit and loss or the actual cost of a book. That's really, really helpful to understand if you can break down what it costs a publishing house for the labor, what it costs to print. So short is good too.
Okay, I think with that, we'll give our editors a round of applause. Thank you so much.